All right. Yes, they added more items to the menu, and the record item has vanished from the menu. You've got to follow an arrow and find it. Very clever. Okay, thank you for joining me again on Talmud in Technicolor. Again, we're doing with Sechet Sukkah, Perek Lulav and Arava, and we're on Windaf Mem Zayin Omalalav 47a. And we are going to start from roughly halfway down the page, but just a very brief resume of what we were discussing last week. We actually ended one topic and we started a new topic. We're going to pick up on that new topic because that new topic is also fairly extensive. But the topic we ended was the discussion of the situation in Chutz La'aretz on Shmini Atzeres, which in Chutz La'aretz, Shmini Atzeres is treated as if it were a Safek day, the 8th day. Is it really Shmini Atzeret, which has certain distinct rules applicable to it, or is it actually only the 7th day, the 7th day of Sukkot? Of course, if the day is the 7th day of Sukkot, then we have the full array of Sukkot mitzvahs that we should really observe. But if the day is the 8th day and we make ourselves as if we don't know, then it's Shmini Atzeres and we don't observe any of those Sukkot mitzvahs. So what do we do? And that's the basic question which the Gemara tackles, which is obviously we've been have sorted that one out by the time we reach the 21st century. But the Gemara, in discussing the core question there, has various opinions. And we follow the opinion formally, I think it is of Rabbi Yochanan. And the halacha that he provides us is that on the 7th day, on the 8th day, sorry, in Chutz La'aretz, which includes Bovel, not just Eretz Yisrael, but Bovel, even in Talmudic times, as well as Europe and America and everywhere else, Bisman Hazer, we continue to sit in the sukkah, even though it's Shmini Atzeres, but we don't make a bracha because we're not sure that it really is Sukkot. So therefore, we do the sitting, but we don't recite a bracha. The bracha is too serious, containing the Shem Hashem, to recite if it really is not a mitzvah of the day, if it really is Shemini Atzeres. But sitting has been no big deal. So we go into the sukkah and we sit in the sukkah, but we don't make a bracha. And in terms of the tefillot of the day, we recite everything as if we knew it was Shemini Atzeres. We say Yom Shemini Atzeres Hazeh Lachem in Ya'aleh V'Yovo. All the davening makes no mention of the fact that it could possibly be the 7th day of Sukkot. The only vestige of the possibility of 7th day Sukkot is the sitting in the sukkah, albeit without a bracha. We don't take lulav and esrog because that would be too blatantly reflective of the fact that we knew it was Sukkot, because you would never pick up a lulav and esrog anyway, unless it's Sukkot. But we sit in the sukkah because that's considered to be fairly neutral, according to the halachic position, because you could sit in your garden shed or on the under the path of your pagoda or whatever you happen to have, or pergola at any point in time. It doesn't prove it's a Yom Tov. So that's why the Gemara makes that sort of compromise, sitting but no bracha. Of course, Bisman Hazer, in most communities, people don't sit all day, even on Shmini Atzeret in Chutz La'aretz. There are various minhagim. And as I said, one of the reasons for this is that in most of the world, which after Bovel was the Northern Hemisphere, where it was rather cold on Sukkot, to sit in the Sukkah Dafka on Shmini Atzeres is a blatant testimonial that it is still Sukkot, the 7th day. And it pays no respect to the fact that it might actually be the 8th day in Shmini Atzeret. So essentially, many of us just have a minhag to make a kiddush in the sukkah. There's a whole spectrum of minhagim associated with how Sukkot you make your Shmini Atzeres day, whether you do anything in the sukkah, whether you go the whole way and do all the meals in the sukkah, but without a brach. So those were the discussions that we had around Shmini Atzeres, Bisman Hazer, and Chutz La'aretz. Of course, in Eretz Yisrael, everything's clear. The first day is the first day, the 7th day is the last day of Sukkot, the 8th day is Shmini Atzeres. It is fully 100% Shmini Atzeres, and there is no 9th day of Simchat Torah, because we absorb Simchat Torah in Shmini Atzeres, and we make a bit of a strudel of it. But that's what we do in Eretz Yisrael. So this whole question of the Gemara was only relevant for Chutz La'aretz and not for Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara then started a second topic, and we're going to take up that topic really almost from the beginning again to take us through, and that is the question of Shehechianu. Let's say we know exactly what we do on each day as far as the mitzvot are concerned. The question still remains, how do we treat it as far as whether we should make a Shechianu on the night of Shmini Atzeres? Do we consider it to be novel enough, Shmini Atzeres, separate enough from the other days of Sukkot, to earn a separate Shechianu? The Gemara is sort of roundabout begins to tell us why and in what circumstances we say Shechianu. Unfortunately, here in the beginning, the Gemara doesn't really give us a definition and say, here are the circumstances under which you would recite a Shechianu. Here's other circumstances under which you would not recite Shechianu. You rather have to work them through as you go through the Gemara. As we're talking about the Shechianu for a Chag, we're not talking here about the Shechianu you make when you buy something new, which you're celebrating, which is a separate mitzvah and doesn't depend upon the time of year. But we're talking about the Shechianu, which is recited in relation to a new Yom Tov. When Yom Tov comes in, not Shabbat, but when Yom Tov comes in, and we haven't had that Yom Tov for a long time, on the first night of the Yom Tov, we make a Shechianu. First night of Sukkot, first night of Peres, Pesach, on Shavuot, etc. We make a Shechianu, and that is referred to, as we'll see in the Gemara, as Zaman, time. Because in our Shechianu, we say Shechianu, Vikimanu, Vehigianu, Lazman Hazer. So essentially, the Shechianu is about us coming round again to the same time of year. And we celebrate the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has preserved us in order to be able to meet this Yom Tov yet again. We hadn't met it for a long time, and now we're meeting it again. But we will only make a Shechianu really the first time we meet it again in this cycle. So we don't make the Shechianu every night of Sukkot. Even we don't make it on every night of Pesach either. The Gemara is going to look at Pesach separately. But the question over here we're asking is whether Shmini Atzeres, which is like the 8th day of Sukkot, deserves a Shechianu for itself on the night of Shmini Atzeres, or whether it's not sufficiently different from the first 7 days of Sukkot for it to merit a separate Shechianu. And if that were the case, it would mean that the Shechianu you made on the first night would carry you all the way through, including for Shmini Atzeres. And it seems the Gemara is not at all convinced in some way that that Shmini Atzeres is a separate enough Chag to merit a Shechianu, even though we're going to take up many, many arguments that are to come for the fact that Shmini Atzeres is separate. In fact, it seems, if you look at the mitzvahs, patently obvious that Shmini Atzeres is separate from Sukkot. None of the things we do on Shmini Atzeres are those things that we do on Sukkot. Those things we do on Sukkot, we terminate at the end of the 7th day. We don't do them anymore in Eretz Yisrael on Shmini Atzeres. And the Gemara is going to argue that as well. Yet the Gemara still makes it possible that we should not recite a separate Shechianu on Shmini Atzeres. It still brings that in as a possibility. If I just share my screen for you a moment, just to show why that might be the case, which I have done, yeah. If you look at some of the psukim, I mean, we're looking at Emor, we're looking at Pinchas, we're looking at more than one spot in the Chumash when we look at the verses that define the regolim for us. And here's a set that I think this is from a Parshas Emor. So it says in the Chumash, Daber el b'nei Yisrael lemor, b'chamisha osa yom lachodesh, on the 15th day of that month, Hashvi, Tishri, Hazer, Chag HaSukkot, Shivas Yomim LaHashem. It says 7 days. It doesn't say 8 days. So you'll tell me from that it's patently clear that Sukkot is only 7 days, and therefore Shmini Atzeres is a separate Yom Tov. So what's all the fuss about? Is it a separate Yom Tov? Isn't? Well, let's go on and see why it becomes less clear. The next pasuk says, "By Yom HaRishon Mikra Kodesh, Kol Meleches Avoda Lo Sasu." The first day will be a holy day, and all work may not be done. Also on the 7th day, but this is a different Posuk doesn't mention the 7th day. Shivas Yomim Takrivu Ishela Hashem. Those 7 days of Sukkot, you should offer a burnt offering to Hashem. And now, by Yom Hashmini, on the 8th day, which is Shmini Atzeres, Mikra Kodesh Yelachem will be another holy day. V'kraftem Ishel Hashem Atzeres hi kol melechas avoda lo sasu. And I've deliberately separated the highlight color over here, because what you're seeing over here is that the Chumash seems to somehow tangle Shmini Atzeres into Sukkot. And if you're truly a separate Chag, maybe we wouldn't expect that to happen. 7 days you do this, and on the 8th day you do that. If I say that to you, on 7 days you do this, and on the 8th day you do that, you might say to me that you understood that the whole lot was 8 days, like one Chag, but there are 7 days you behave one way, and on the 8th day you behave a different way. So there's some sort of hint in the Posuk that Shmini Atzeres is almost the 8th day of Sukkot. And if it's only the 8th day of Sukkot, it should not merit its own Shechionu. So that may be some of the workings behind the Gemara not being convinced that Shmini Atzeres is separate enough in order to merit its own Shechionu on the night of Shmini Atzeres. But let's see how the Gemara tackles that, because the Gemara is going to tackle the reasons why it is distinctive enough to merit its own bracha. So I'm going to take you I'm going to have to start counting, which is a shame. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I think it's 16 lines down from the top of 47a Mem Zayin on Aleph, the sheet which I appended on your Gemara. And it's the beginning of the line, Omer Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan said, Omrim Zman Bashmini Shel Chag. One does say Zman. Remember, I said Zman meant Shechionu on the night of the 8th day of the festival package, which means Shmini Atzeres. However, and this is interesting, the Gemara is going to tackle this. This is the contrast. Ve'ein Omrim Zman B'Shvi Shel Pesach. But you don't say Shechionu on the 7th night of Pesach. Remember, what happens on Pesach? First day, let's look at Eretz Yisrael. There's no 2 days. It just confuses us if we go back to 2 days. First day of Pesach is a Yontov. And then we have Chol HaMoed. And then the 7th day is another Yontov. So what are the arguments there? Should we say a second Shechionu on the 7th, on the night of the 7th? And we make Kiddush. We don't make Kiddush on the 3rd night and the 4th night, but when we make Kiddush again on the night of the 7th day of Pesach, should we ask ourselves whether there should be Shechionu there? Yes, we should ask ourselves, but Rabbi Yochanan's answering it very distinctly no. And that's a halacha. We don't make a Shechionu on the 7th, even though we're making a Kiddush and we've had a few days of Chol HaMoed in between. Why? Because Pesach is one package deal. There is no real distinction between the 7th day and the 1st day. And therefore, the Shechionu we make on the night of the 1st day carries us through. The Gemara is going to make that clearer. However, when it comes to the 8th day, Shmini Atzeres of Sukkot, that is sufficiently distinct that we should make its own Shechionu. This is the halacha of Rabbi Yochanan. And now the Gemara is going to explain why this should be the case. V'omer Rabbi Levi bar Chama, v'itema Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, and Rabbi Levi, the son of Chama, or it may have been Rabbi Chama, the son of Chanina, he said, Teda, there's a proof that you should know that Shmini Atzeres deserves its own Shechionu, and it's this: Shahari Cholok Bishlosha Devarim. It is the fact that Shmini Atzeres is distinct in 3 ways. And what he's going to say, actually, at least 2 bits of it are so patently obvious, we don't need him to tell us that. But let's read what he says. What are the 3? Besukkah, the first way in which Shmini Atzeres is distinct from the 7 days of Sukkah that precede it, is that we don't sit in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. And remember, we're talking about Eretz Yisrael, we're not talking about Chutz Loretz with the suffix. If you know when it's Shmini Atzeres, at the end of the 7 days, there's nothing more of the Sukkah. There is no sitting in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. So it's distinct by not having the mitzvah of Sukkah. The Lulav, again obvious. We don't take lulav and Shmini Atzeres, so it's distinct by not having the mitzvah of lulav. V'nisuch hamayim, and also something that we don't do nowadays. When the Mizbeach was there during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, there was the libation of water that was taken up from the city of David and carried up with song, and it was poured over the Mizbeach every day. This was done during Sukkot. It was called the this was the Nesachim that were put on to the Mizbeach during the 7 days of Sukkot, and this was not done on Shmini Atzeres. So in those 3 distinct ways, Shmini Atzeres distinguishes itself from the first 7 days. And therefore, being so distinct and so different, it deserves a Shechiyonu of its own. That's the argument. But he goes on to say, this is a technical addition, really. Le Rab Yehuda Da'amar Balog Balog means, a log is a volume, like so many liters, that they did actually libate with water over the Mizbeach. All 8 days, that's opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, that the Nisoch HaMaim even took place on the 8th day, and not like the opinion we just suggested before that was only during the 7th day of Sukkot. Rabbi Yehuda holds that the libation took place also on the 8th day. Nevertheless, Hari Cholok Bishnei Devarim, big deal. It still distinguishes itself from the first 7 days in 2 ways, even if it's not the 3rd way. The 2 ways are sukkah and lulav. Now this is saying the obvious to us, but Rabbi Levi is putting this forward as Rabbi Yochanan's reason for saying that a Shechiyonu is required on the night of Shmini Atzeres, despite the fact that if I showed you the posuk before, you could almost have imagined the Torah was telling you there were 1 unit. But since the mitzvot are so distinct, it merits a Shechiyonu for its own. Shechiyonu, you look at the word Shechiyonu, it means to revive, in a sense, to renew. We have something completely new. When you move from one phase to another phase, in a sense, you can say a Shechiyonu. So you moved from weekday to Yontef, you say a Shechiyonu, right? However, if you say that the 7 days of Sukkot are not sufficiently different from Shmini Atzeres, then you haven't done anything novel in moving into Shmini Atzeres, and you would not say Shechiyonu. And Rabbi Levi is saying with the differences in mitzvot are sufficiently significant that they represent a new phase, and moving into that new phase, we say Shechiyonu. Okay, now that's labored something which seems fairly obvious, but as you go, and we're going to ask a question about Pesach, you'll see things are a little bit fuzzier than they might at first seem. Says the Gemara, if that is the case, that when there is a difference in the halachot, if you like, or a difference in the mitzvot, so that represents a new phase, that the beginning of that new phase merits a Shechiyonu, then I have a question to ask. If this is the case, as we've explained it, Shavi'i shel Pesach nami, why do we not make a Shechiyonu? And we don't. Why do we not make a Shechiyonu on the night of the 7th day of Pesach? Surely one could argue, Hari Cholok ba'achilas matzah, it differs from the first days in terms of achilas matzah. I'll have to explain this very confusing statement to you. You thought that matzah applied all 7 days. We'll have to explain this. To Amama, because didn't the master, in fact, or once say, Laila Rishona Chova, Mikan ve'elech Rishus, that the requirement to eat matzah is only on the first night, Seder night. For the rest of the time, it is only optional, discretional to eat matzah. And therefore, the 7th day, when we make Kiddush, hey, it's a discretion day as far as matzah is concerned. First day is not a discretion day. Let me just, this sounds a little bit splitting hairs, but isn't that what we often do? So let me just take you to Pesach eating matzah. So first night, first day, 7th day. I've made 3 divisions here because there aren't just 2, there are 3. And we'll see why in a moment, because the first day of Pesach itself is divided into 2. On the first night, this is Seder night, it is mandatory for us to have our kazayas of matzah. Why do we know that? How do we know that? Because the Pasuk says, Bo'erev tochlu matzos. In that evening, you shall eat matzahs. What evening is this? It is Seder night. Hey, what about the rest of Pesach? The rest of Pesach, if you want to suffice eating mashed potatoes and eggs, you never need to eat another matzah after the first night. Of course, you can't eat chometz and you can't eat bread, but who requires you to eat matzah? It is not a requirement to eat matzah at all. It's only the first night where it's a requirement, where it's a chovah. All the other days, it's a reshus, it's discretion. And therefore, already by the morning of the first day, it's optional. You want to eat anything on the first day. So the first 24-hour period of Pesach is in fact already divided into two phases. There's the night where it's mandatory to eat matzah, and in the day it isn't. And of course, seventh day, all Chol HaMoed, including the seventh day, is optional. So the Gemara is asking this kasha, which you probably think is a bit of an impudent kasha, because it's not really, it's too easily answered, as we'll see in a moment. The Gemara is asking this. If you are going to say that a Shechayano is always needed to introduce a Yontif day, which is distinct in some way from the beginning of Yontif day, it's distinct, just as we said Shmini Atzeres was really distinct from the first day when you made Shechayano, first day of Sukkot, then you could argue the same for Pesach. You could argue, well, the first day of Pesach, at least the night of the first day of Pesach, this is where, the argument unravels a bit. At least the night of the first day of Pesach, Seder night, eating matzah is mandatory. Whereas on the seventh day, like all the intermediate days, you're going to make Kiddush again on the night of the seventh day, it's optional. So why don't I say already, no, hey, presto, Shechayanu. When I made my Shechayanu on the first night, I was in a phase when I had to eat matzah, it was compulsory. Now I'm coming in and saying Kiddush again on the seventh night. I'm in a phase where it's optional. Change. A change is as good as a rest. Maybe you should need to say a separate Shechayonu. Why do we not make a Shechayonu? That's the argument the Gemara is making. And of course, this is a very much subtler version than the distinction we saw between the first days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. So Shmini Atzeres is much more different from Sukkot, because the major mitzvahs of Sukkot disappear altogether on Shmini Atzeres. You can't really argue it's not quite as obviously defined when it comes to the seventh day of Pesach. Nevertheless, the Gemara is saying, how long is a piece of string? If you're looking for differences, well, there is a difference between the seventh day and the first day, because there is no chiyuv to eat matzahs. I mean, I could ask you this question. Why is the Gemara talking here about matzahs? Why didn't the Gemara say something else here? On the first night, you've got all the mitzvahs of morrow, you've got arba kosis, you've got everything else. We don't have any of that on the seventh night. So it is very, very, very severely different. So why pick on the matzah when you could pick on everything else? I'm not 100% sure why that's the case, and it could be because the same answer which the Gemara will give will answer it, even if you ask the question not in relation to the matzah, but all the other mitzvahs of Seder night, and said, well, the seventh day doesn't have any of all that, so it's distinct. Then the answer the Gemara gives will perhaps suffice for that as well. Let's have a look and see how the Gemara answers. The Gemara is in the situation now that it gave us a rationale for when you say a Shechayanu. And its rationale was that when the mitzvahs of the day we're going into are sufficiently different from those that you've been in before, when you made your first Shechayanu, then it's time to make a new Shechayanu. The Gemara therefore asks, well, I can argue the same for Pesach. The seventh day is sufficiently different from the first day. So the Gemara is going to say, no. You've stretched this argument too far to tell me that Pesach is the same situation. It isn't. Hachi hashta is a form of exclamation. It sort of means, so now? Are you really coming into an argument in this absurd manner? It's not at all true. Hassam, when it comes to the seventh day of Pesach, there, when you talk about Pesach, milayla cholok, the first day was even different to the first night, but miyom eino cholok. But the seventh day is not different to the first day. I'll explain it on my chart in a moment. When it comes to Shmini Atzeres, afili miyom nami choluk. The 8th day is even different to the first day. The Gemara is answering very simply, really. Look, it is true that on the first night there is a difference and we have mandatory eating of matzah. But when you look at the first day, the next morning, first day of Pesach, you're coming into shul with a stomach ache already, or whatever it is, already it's optional to eat matzah. So apart from that first night, the first day is an optional day for eating matzah. And you made a shechiyonu, not just on the Seder, but on the whole of the first day, including the daylight hours when it was optional. The night of the 7th day, it's also optional. There is no difference between optional here and optional there. It's optional on the first day after the night. It's optional on the 7th day. So therefore, we haven't got a difference in mitzvahs. When it comes to it, the things we do in the daylight hours of the first day of Pesach are no different to those we do on the 7th day. We may have a different haftarah and laning, etc., but it's exactly the same. We don't take lulav and esrog in one and not in the other. We don't sit in the sukkah in one. We have no difference. So therefore, it does not merit a separate shechiyonu, the Gemara says, because looking at the first day and comparing to the 7th day, they are the same. There is no difference between the way we conduct ourselves during the daylight parts of first day and that of the 7th day, and therefore no shechiyonu is needed. The first shechiyonu we made at the Seder night when we made Kiddush will take us all the way through, and we don't need another. Remember, I also mentioned last week, that this whole thing with brachas, do we make another bracha? Do we not make another bracha? Brachas are taken very seriously by the halacha. We don't just make brachas willy-nilly. You don't do things just to make a bracha. I mean, there's this mitzvah, you'll tell me that you should make 100 brachas a day, but they should all be merited. In other words, they should all have a halachic basis. If we felt that there was no need for a second shechiyonu, we wouldn't make a second shechiyonu. That's why we're treating shechiyonu seriously enough that we have to have a cogent argument before we will make a shechiyonu again on the last day of Yom Tov. The Gemara now gives another answer, which is similar really, but to explain why the 7th day of Pesach is different from the first day. It's not it's got to do with what is consecutive and what isn't consecutive. Ravina said, we'll just have a look at his words first, says the Gemara. Zer cholek min shelefonov, Shmini Atzeres is distinct from what came just before it, which is the 7th day of Sukkot. In other words, the 7th day of Sukkot, you sat in the sukkah and you took lulav and esrog. On the 8th day, with Shmini Atzeres, you don't do any of these things. So we flow from the day before, which is the 7th day of Sukkot, when you had all these mitzvahs, to Shmini Atzeres, where you don't have those mitzvahs. So that's, if you like, a real discrete break in the between the 2 days in terms of the conduct of the 2 days. They're very different. It's a cliff edge. We go from the 7th day of Sukkot when we do all the Sukkot mitzvahs to the 8th day when we don't do any of those mitzvahs. Instantaneously, we move from one phase to the other. However, the 7th day of Pesach, however, if you want to make a comparison, is only cholok mishelifnei lefonov. It's only distinct from what came before what came before. What does that mean? Look again over here on Pesach, on my chart. The 7th day of Pesach, it's optional. Well, all 6 days, first day is not just the first day. It goes up to the 6th day of Cholam, which is Cholam Moed. It's also optional. So when that 7th day came in on that night, there was no cliff edge in conduct between what took place before that and the 7th day. There was an optional. Where was it distinct from? It was distinct from that first night, but that first night was before, if you know what I mean, because the before of the 7th day was also optional. It's only before the first night where it was mandatory. So therefore, since we don't flow from a mandatory position directly into an optional position, that distinction isn't considered to be so severe. We're moving from an optional to an optional. It's only comparison with the first day that's different. So this is a slightly different answer, but they're both aimed at explaining why there should be no need for a shechionu on the seventh night. It's not sufficiently different. It's only different from the first night. And therefore, we don't make a shechionu. And that is the halacha. Okay. Let me just stop sharing for a moment. Okay. Now the Gemara gives another distinction between the Shmini Atzeres and the 7 days of Sukkot. We thought we've exhausted all those distinctions, haven't we? We said that there's no Nisuch HaMayim, according to most opinions. There's no taking of Lulav and Esrog on Shmini Atzeres. There is no mitzvah sitting in the Sukkah in Eretz Yisrael on the 8th day. Compared to the other days, we see that there were all these distinctions. The Gemara, if you're not happy enough, the Gemara is saying, I'll give you another distinction between Shmini Atzeres and the first 7 days of Sukkot, which merits Shmini Atzeres having its own bracha. And this time it's not what we do, but it's what was done in the Beis HaMikdash. So it's not something which is so obvious to us. Says the Gemara, Rav Papa Amar. Rav Papa said the following. Hocha ksiv par hosam ksiv parim. What are we talking about over here? We're talking here about the karbonos of the Chag. But if you're interested, looking at Parshas Emor and Parshas Pinchas, it teaches you all the karbonot that are brought. And the karbonot of Sukkot are quite complicated. We'll show you in a moment. And Shmini Atzeres is very distinct in terms of the karbonos that are brought. So, and the Gemara is arguing, and Rav Papa is going to argue, that even if you're not convinced about the distinctiveness of Shmini Atzeres from Sukkot on the grounds that we previously brought, you should become distinct, you should be convinced on the basis of the difference in karbonos, because they're also indicative, because that's a form of avodah. It's avodas Hashem in the Beis HaMikdash. And when the avodah is completely different, you know something's changed. And it shows that it would merit a shechiyon of its own. So let me share my screen with you, because the karbonot, this is something you come across when you do the Musaf of the Amida on Sukkot. Is very complicated, the Musaf one on the art scroll tries to explain it, but it is a bit complicated. So over here, let's take this first table. I'm just going to make this a bit bigger. Yeah, everything's there. I try to make life very easy for everyone in this year, everyone except myself, because I have quite a lot of preparation. So we're talking about the number of bullocks that are brought as on the Mizbeach. L'chvod HaChag, special for Musaf, the special karbonos that represented the distinct avodah of Sukkot. And when it comes to Sukkot, the karbonos that were brought, as far as the bullocks were concerned, were different every day. And there's a long parsha on the first day, on the second day, on the third day. And here's what they are. On the first day, 13 bullocks are brought. Seems quite a lot. It's very, very busy. This is the opposite of the Hanukkah candles, where you go from 1 to 8. Here we're going to go down in number. In fact, the Gemara actually brings this as a contrast. We're going to go down and descend. Don't we say, that we go up Madreg and not go down? But anyway, let's have a look and see. They have 13 on the first day, 12 on the second day, 11 on the third day, 10, 9, 8, 7. On the 7th day of Sukkot, we bring 7 bullocks. It doesn't go lower than that because they're only 7 days, and we start from 13, so we reach 7. On Shemini Atzeres, we bring just 1. Why don't we bring 6? If we'd have brought 6, then you could argue that Shemini Atzeres, based upon this trend line, was just an extension of Sukkot. But we don't. We only bring 1, which is a clean break from the style of the Karbonos during the previous 7 days, which indicates that Shmini Atzeres is a separate Chag. So this is the proof the Gemara is bringing now in Karbonos. It's a totally different proof, but it's a very convincing proof that it stands by itself because of the difference. If that was really the 8th day, there should have been 6, 9, 8, 7, 6. We should have continued the trend. Just out of interest, this is a well-known fact. Chazal say if you add up all these numbers here, and I'm sure you've done this already, the number is 70. you get to 70. There's a grand total of 70 brought over these 7 days. Ignore Shmini Atzeres because that's separate. So it's 70. And it's often said, this is the sort of drosha you give on Shmini Atzeres, that during Sukkot, we celebrate a Chag which is available for the whole world. It's a universalistic Chag. There's this well-known medrash that there are Shivim Umas, there are 70 nations. However many number of nations there are now distinctly, with flags. I mean, it's Ukraine and Latvia and Lithuania or whatever it is. In terms of the biblical nations, there are 70, if you like, biblical nations. And they have spawned what we have in the world today. That's the tradition we have. And therefore, during Sukkot, we bring 70 bullocks. Essentially, we're actually offering up, we're doing Lavoda on behalf of each of the Shivim Umos. It's very nice saying. What is Shmini Atzeres? Shmini Atzeres is when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, on the 8th day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Klal Yisrael, you know what? I've let you worship and to offer up praises on behalf of all the nations of the world during the last 7 days. On this 8th day, I want you to remain behind, and I want you and I to be alone. And therefore, we only bring one bullock. That represents Klal Yisrael, right? So the 7 days previously represent all the Umas Ha'olam, and the day of Shmini Atzeres represents Klal Yisrael. That's a symbolism which Chazal have given to the numbers of Korbanos. Just interesting, I'm not this a well-known theme that there's a universality in the festival of Sukkot, which there isn't in Pesach or Shavuot. Those are considered to be purely for Klal Yisrael, but somehow Umas Ha'olam also come into the reckoning, and we see this in these messianic statements. Here's Zechariah, and he says this is the view of the future when everything will be fine and good, and the lion will lie down with the lamb, and we beat our swords into plowshares, etc. And it says, "V'hoya kol hanosam kol hagoyim habom al Yerushalayim." All those who survived from all those nations that came against Jerusalem, v'olu midei shana b'shana. In this new age, this new era, they will come up year after year. Lihishtachavos lemelech Hashem tzavaos. They will come to worship in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Yerushalayim. They will come up to the Beis Hamikdash in this new dawn. V'lochog es Chag HaSukkos, to celebrate Chag HaSukkos. Why Chag HaSukkos? What's wrong with Shabbos? What's wrong with Pesach? What's wrong? This is the only festival that has a universality theme to it. The sukkah, and you can think about the schach as being a canopy. This is a canopy that covers the whole of mankind and not just Klal Yisrael. It is the festival that is going to cover also the non-Jews in the Yemos HaMashiach. This is the idea, and we see this directly from the Navi. So you can see where the Medrashim come from, that the 70 represents the Umas Ha'olam. Okay, so this is yet another proof that Shmini Atzeres is distinctive and merits its own Shechiyonu because it doesn't follow the pattern of the Korbanos of the Chag that preceded. Okay, now let's just go on a little bit further. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Omar. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, he brings yet a further proof. I've said this before, sometimes you see the Gemara brings proof after proof after proof, or opinion after opinion after opinion, or source after source after source, when we've already established something completely, and we're not going to renege on it anyway. But we see over here essentially like a transcript of the discussions that took place in the yeshivas in Bavel, and therefore everyone had something to say, and we're seeing this brought down now. And they were not all contemporaries; they would have lived at different periods, and we're seeing this wild mixture of possibly 300 years worth of conversations, which look as though they're all around a table in discussion at a shul board meeting. But in fact, one of them would have been a great grandfather of the other. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, here's another reason that Shmini Atzeres is distinct, and I can learn it from the wording in the Pasuk. Let's not look at mitzvahs, just look at the way the Torah phrases the verses that deal with Sukkot and then Shmini Atzeres. And he says this, he says, Hocha, when it comes to the 8th day, the Hocha means the 8th day, Shmini Atzeres, Ksiv Bayom, it says, The pasuk says, "Bayom hashmini atzeres tiyeh lachem." On the 8th day, it says Bayom hashmini. But Hossam, when it comes to the previous 7 days, it doesn't say Bayom harishon, Bayom hasheni, Bayom hash. After Bayom, it says Uvayom hasheni, Uvayom hashlishi, Uvayom harivi. But for Shmini Atzeres, it says Bayom hashmini. Why doesn't it say Uvayom hashmini? So he says, if you're looking at just instantly the sentence construction, if the 8th day, which is Shmini Atzeres, was really just meant to be a continuation of Sukkot and not distinctive, just like it says, and on the 2nd day, and on the 3rd day, and on the 4th day, it would say, and on the 8th day. But it doesn't say that. It says on the 8th day. It's as if it started a new sentence, right? It's distinctive. It's a new paragraph. That's why it says Bayom Hashmini and not Uvayom Hashmini. And that itself is, if you like, a linguistic argument to say that Shmini Atzeres is distinct from the first 7 days. So you're really learning everything. The Gemara is really giving you every possible approach here. The mitzvahs, the text, the korbanos, or to show that each of them point to a distinctiveness in Shmini Atzeres. And Rav Ashi Omar, Rav Ashi hasn't said his bit yet. Rav Ashi is one of the last of the Amoraim in terms of, he's credited with being an editor of Talmud Bavli. And he says the following, and very often you find Rav Ashi's comments at the end of a line of arguments, which doesn't necessarily mean the rest are chronological, but it does make sense to put Rav Ashi in the end, because Rav Ashi's opinion would have been almost the last opinion on a particular topic. Rav Ashi Omar, Hacha, in the case of Shmini Atzeres, the Hacha means the 8th day of Sukkot. Ksiv, what does it say? Ksiv kam mishpat. Again, the Gemara only gives you a little trickle of the extract, the posuk. The posuk is really saying, and I've not shown it to you over here, otherwise there's so many psukim, min chasam v'niskehem, it means their meal offerings and their libations of all those korbanos, it's related to the korbanos, according to their numbers, kamishpat, according to the rule. Mishpat here doesn't mean judgment, really, it means the rule. You bring all your libations and all your korbanos according to the rule. What rule? The rule that I've established here in these psukim, that's what it means. Don't play around. It should be brought according to the rule. That's what it says for the 8th day. However, Hossam, when it comes to the libations and everything else of the previous 7 days, it uses an analogous phrase, but not an identical phrase. It says, Kemishpatom, according to their rules. So again, you see something interesting over here. The Torah is saying, when it comes to the details relating to the korbanos of the 7 days of Sukkot, Kemishpatom, according to their rules. Their rules mean their rules of all those days of Yom Tov. But then it goes on, says the 8th day, it says kamishpat. It's distinctive. It is its rules. In other words, there's a them, and an us, so to speak, if you're looking at it that way. There's a there, that's Sukkot, all the first day of Sukkot, first 7 days of Sukkot. And then there is the 8th day, which is kamishpat, has its own unique set of rules. A subtle difference between the 8th day and the 7 days. Now, I'm sure none of these sages are arguing with each other. They're just all adding an extra observation, which to them manifests a different distinction that the Torah is teaching us. And in grand total, they show how different Shmini Atzeres is from Sukkot. So even though, the problem is it comes at the 8th day. You've done 7 days of Sukkot. So it's the 8th day. You say Sukkot is 8 days long. It isn't 8 days long. It is 7 days long. And then there's this thing called Shmini Atzeres, which the Gemara's great length proven to you should not be mentioned in the same breath as Sukkot, because it isn't Sukkot, it is distinctive. Okay. The Gemara now wants to bring a raya to what Rabbi Yochanan said. What did Rabbi Yochanan say? He said that on the 8th night of Pesach, on the 8th night of Sukkot, which means Shmini Atzeres. I shouldn't say the 8th night of Sukkot. I get myself into a tangle, right? There are 7 days of Sukkot, and then there's Shmini Atzeres, which just by coincidence happens to fall in the tail end of Sukkot. That day of Shmini Atzeres, he says, deserves its own Shechiyanu. That's what he said. And the Gemara has given you lots of reasons. But the fact that it deserves its Shechiyanu, that was the actual halacha of Rabbi Yochanan. Didn't give us a reason. He just said, you know, it has its own, it deserves its own Shechiyanu. So Gemara says, Lema Misaile, maybe Rabbi Yochanan's opinion can be proven by the following brisa. The Gemara is going to bring a brisa, a Tanaitic halacha, from which it wants to derive that Rabbi Yochanan's halacha could be learned from this brisa as well. Remember, Rabbi Yochanan's an Amora. So every time the Gemara is able to bring a backup for a halachic statement made by an Amora from a Mishnah or from a brisa, it does so because it makes the statement of the Amora more authoritative. Once he has a backup, you know, of a Mishnah or a brisa, then he's much more authoritative, and his view is much less likely to be questioned. So let's say we found a brisa that seems to accord with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan can sit well and tight to say a bracha of Shechiyanu on 8th day on the basis of this brisa. Let's read the brisa first. The brisa, I'm afraid, over here is a little bit technical. And we only need a little bit of it. In fact, we only need one phrase from it to prove Rabbi Yochanan's point. But we've got to understand the Gemara, and so we will now make an effort. Lema Messiah, Haporim, this is what the brisa says. Haporim, ha'elim, v'hakvosim, ma'akvin zeh et zeh. First opinion. Bullocks, rams, and sheep. They ma'akvim zeh et zeh. They hold each other back, or they can prevent each other from happening. What does that mean? Okay, I can never. There are some words in Hebrew, in halacha, which you just can't translate, but you can explain. We're talking about the Korbanos Achag again. Let's talk about the 7th day, 7 days of Sukkot. And I showed you already, let me just go back and share screen, that there was a pattern to those Korbanot, right? And here were the bullocks. Yes, there are 13 on day 1, 12 on day 2, 11 on day 3, whatever, etc., down to 7 on day 7. Let's for a moment forget about Shmini Atzeres. Let's treat that as a separate topic. But this is the sequence of numbers, and the Torah prescribes these for us. These are not from the Chacham, and the Torah prescribes these from it. In addition to those bullocks, we also had to bring rams and sheep. I mentioned the bullocks earlier because they nicely descend 13, 12, 11, etc. But there are also rams and sheep. Those are the Elim and Kvosim. Ayol is a ram and Kevis is a sheep. And we brought sets of those every day as well. You see, the Kohanim were quite busy. They didn't have much time on their hands. On day 1, and in fact, all 7 days of Sukkot, 2 rams, 2/14 means 2 rams and 14 sheep were bought each day. So on day 2, for example, you bring 12 bullocks, 2 rams, and 14 sheep. Sounds like a famous Christmas song. I'm very tempted to sing it, but I don't want to. It wouldn't be appropriate, especially as I'm recording these shiurim. So you bring 2 rams and 14 sheep for every day of Sukkot, and then on Shmini Atzeret you bring 1. It's half as much. 1 ram and 7 sheep. And by the way, that's another distinct feature between Shmini Atzeres and the rest of Sukkot. You've had the number of korbanos. It should have been the same with 1 yonder. But the Gemara is now looking at a halacha in Zvochim, in korbanos. Sometimes we say that a particular ritual in korbanos is ma'akev. And sometimes we say it isn't ma'akev. When we say it's ma'akev, it means that if you don't do it, it throws the whole thing into a non-event. You might as well not, if you don't do it properly in some way, don't do it at all. There's no way of saying, well, I can do 3/4 of it, but I can't do it all. You gain nothing by doing it. It's all or nothing when you say something is ma'akev. So certain aspects of korbanot and I'm not just talking about over here, but in the Masechah Zavachim it says they're ma'akev. If you miss out this, then the whole ceremony doesn't work. There are other things which you should do, and the Torah says you should do them, but Chazal learn from the Pesukim, they are not ma'akev, which means if you miss them out by some accident, the carbon is still acceptable. It can still go on the Mizbeach, and it can still effect whatever kapara you wanted to effect. Certain things have to be done, otherwise the carbon is ineffective, others don't have to. Over here, the Brisa is saying, the first opinion anyway, that everything about these carbonos on Sukkot is me'akev, which means if you didn't do it properly, you might as well not do it at all. Which means, for example, let's say on day 2, when you should have brought 12 bullocks, you could only find 9. Yeah, you run out of bullocks. What do? Do you bring 9? No, because the details are ma'akev. You can't bring 9. Yeah, that's the idea that me'akvim zeh et zeh. If you can't bring the necessary amount, you shouldn't. And it would also seem to mean that if you couldn't bring, shall we say, 2 sheep on day 4, which you should have done, 2 rams, then you shouldn't bring the 10 bullocks or the 14 sheep either. It's a package. Yeah. So you go to a shop and you say you want to buy yourself an electric iron, and they say they can give you everything except the base or something. You can say, no, I don't want it. You don't have to go for the rest of the iron without the base. You need the base, otherwise you're going to be ironing anything. It's a package. It doesn't work with only components of the package. You have to bring the whole package. They may akiv. So this is the first view in the Brisa, that the required number of bullocks, rams, and sheep are indispensable. You need to bring them all for that day. And if you don't have the full prescription for the day, don't bring anything on that day, because it isn't going to be any good to bring the bits that you do have. That's the meaning of being ma'akev. However, we're not going to get yet to where we're going to bring a proof Rabbi Yochanan. You've got to go further along, but let's try and absorb the ideas here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda was a Tanner as well. He said something a little bit different. He says, Porim ein ma'akvim zeh zeh. When it comes to the number of bullocks, they are not ma'akav zeh zeh. In other words, even if you don't have the full number of bullocks on a particular day, you may bring the ones that you do have. Wait a minute before we give a reason for it. He says they're not me'akav zeh zeh. Whatever you've got, you've got. Well, you haven't got, you should bring the numbers shown, but if you haven't got the numbers shown, we'll take what you've got. However, but he says why for a moment, just do it why. Shahari misma'atin v'holchin. Because the number of bullocks anyway declines day by day. This is a very difficult argument. Let me just put his argument to you, even though I don't understand it. So he says that when it comes to bullocks, they're not going to be ma'akav each other if you don't have the full amount, because you can see, let me put it this way, I'm only using anthropological terms over here. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not makbid. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't really care so much about how many bullocks you bring. How do I know? Well, after all, he said day 1, bring 13, day 4, bring 10, day 6, bring 8. I mean, you can see the numbers are all over the place, which shows that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not ma'akev. He doesn't mind too much. And therefore, if you don't happen to have 11 on day 3 and you've only got 7, bring 7. You can see HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not too concerned about one specific number, because all the way through the Chag, the numbers change. However, when it comes to the rams and the sheep, they are ma'akev. Don't you dare bring anything other than 2/14. If you've only got 1/7, you can't bring it. Why? How do we know? Because every day of Sukkot, ignore Shemini Atzeres, the number's always 2/14. What does that mean? It means as if God was talking to us and saying, you know what? When it comes to rams and sheep, there's only one number that'll ever do. That's 2 rams, 14 sheep. If you can't make me 2 rams, 14 sheep, don't bother. Don't turn up. However, if you can't make the full number of bullocks, Don't worry, because after all, each day I've got a different preference. I don't really mind too much. So I've tried to explain his argument to you, why the rams and sheep are going to, it's all or nothing, but it isn't all or nothing when it comes to the bullocks. I find this argument very difficult because to say that God doesn't really mind too much, because on day 7, he says you only have to bring 7. But didn't he say you have to bring 13 on day 1? How can you say you can get away with 7 if you've only got 7, just because on day 7 he doesn't mind you to bring 7? Maybe he minds you shouldn't bring 7 on day 1. Maybe he wants you to bring 13 on day 1. I cannot understand this argument, and I have to say the commentaries are not very clear on this either. I think they're desperate to try and understand what this really means. It's a very subtle argument he's making over here. This is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, not the first opinion we had in the Tanakh. The first opinion in the Mishnah was there everything is Markov. It's exactly according to the prescription, or it doesn't work. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, the rams and sheep have to be according to the prescription, but the bullocks don't have to be according to the prescription, because we can see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not fussy, because he doesn't have the same number all the way through. So therefore, you bring what you've got. So this is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, right? Let's carry on. The Bryce is not finished yet. We're still in this topic. So Amrulo. So the sages said to Rabbi Yehuda, the sages are the ones who essentially hold the first opinion that everything's Ma'akav. Whether, if it says 13, it's 13. If it says 9 on day 5, you bring 9. None of this business that God isn't fussy. So they say to Rabbi Yehuda, what do you mean to say? What do you mean to say in your argument over here? V'halo kulon mismatin v'holchin bashmini. So here's where we're going to get to Shmini Atzeres. You're saying to me that rams and sheep, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not fussy, because you can see that every day is 2/14. So you can see God, Hashem is obsessed with 2/14. Obviously, you can't bring 1/8 or anything like that, because he's obsessed with 2/14. Say the Chacham Rabbi Yehuda, what do you mean Hashem's obsessed with 2/14? And he's very fussy on 2/14. He isn't. Because on day 8, you only have to bring 1/7. So let me say to you that he's not fussy. And therefore you could bring 1/7 on day 3 as well. You can see he's not fussy on day 8. Now you're going to shout at me and say day 8 is different. This is precisely to the point that the Gemara is going to bring in a moment. But at this stage in the argument, Chachamim is saying, you arguing that Hashem's only fussy, he's only fussy when he only allows one number in the sequence, and then you know he really wants that number and nothing less. However, I can see that when you look over the full 8 days, there's also one odd man out over here. That's day 8, and that's sufficient for me to say that Hashem's not fussy. So therefore, he shouldn't be fussy on day 3 or day 4 either. Maybe you could bring 1/7, and it would be all right, because you could do it on day 8, and Hashem's not fussy. Therefore. That's the Gemara's argument now. And the Gemara's answer is very simple. Amar lahen, Rabbi Yehuda said to the Chachamim, what kind of argument is that about fussiness? That on day 8, you can bring only 1/7 and get away with this. Day 8 is irrelevant, as we've said all the way through. Day 8 has got nothing to do with the first 7 days. Amar lahem, this is a famous statement, Shemini regel bifnei atzmohu. The Shemini Atzeres is a regel bifnei atzmo. It's a yontav all of its own. And the Gemara is going to bring you some other consequences of this in a moment, or the Brisa is. It's a festival all of its own. As far as I'm concerned, we're talking about Sukkot. The days of Sukkah end at day 7. Anything you see on the subsequent days, like bringing me the next Shavuos or something, don't bring irrelevances into the argument. Day 8 is irrelevant because day 8 is a separate Chag. And the fact that this is where we're finally going to come in with a proof, Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said you have to make a Shechayonu even on Shmini Atzeres. And it follows this view that Shmini Atzeres is regel bifnei asmo. Once you define Shmini Atzeres as its own regel, then you don't just have, by the way, Shalosh Regolim. Think about it. There are 4 Regolim. There's Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeres. It's a fact. Next time someone tells you that there are only 3 regalim, you tell them that they haven't learned this particular Gemara. It says Shmini regel bifnei asmohu, and that's why it needs to have a shechianu. And this is the opinion that will back up Rabbi Yochanan. Something we know to be a real separate regel. There's not going to be any argument does it have its own shechianu, in the same way as Pesach has to have its own shechianu. So the 8th day will also have to have its own shechianu. And we don't look at this as a proof that the korbanos differ over the eight days, because that 8th day is nothing to do with the previous 7 days. We'll stop over here. Today's Gemara has been a little bit technical, but I think it's quite interesting Gemara in the way it is arguing from different angles. And I hope you've enjoyed that. We'll take that further next week, please God. Let me just quit recording.